Should you upgrade your motorcycle suspension? This is a good question, isn't it? In this video, I'm gonna share my opinion on this topic. So if you have nothing to do, grab your favorite drink and stay with me. Welcome back. You might say that you don't understand how exactly the suspension works, and because of that you don't care at all and you prefer to ride it as it is, stock for example. Fair enough, but just because you don't understand the laws of physics does not mean that they don't apply to you. It might be in your favor or exactly the opposite, depending on the current situation. I am always amazed by how people spend thousands of dollars for many pointless items but never ever think about the suspension upgrade, even though the suspension is one of the most important elements that you have on the motorcycle and that actually keeps your wheels on the ground. Nowadays, almost every new model, with a very few exceptions, comes with a very basic suspension, and I perfectly understand that because a good quality suspension costs a lot and all the manufacturers try to keep the costs as low as possible. For example, if you want to have a good quality suspension on this Tenere 700, it should cost around 13, not 10,000 euros. It's like a 3,000 euros difference just for the suspension. Fair enough. But as an owner of one of these models, you have to understand that the suspension is responsible for providing constant traction between the tires and the road, no matter what the conditions are. For example, whenever your tire goes into the pothole or a bump, the suspension has to react and cope with it. Depending on the situation, it has to compress or decompress, but always keep the tire on the ground, otherwise you will lose traction. And if you lose traction, I don't have to explain to you what follows. You might say that because you don't ride any off-road, there is no real need for you to upgrade the suspension, but it is not exactly like that, because the same laws applies even if you ride only on the road, because it won't be glass perfect. There will be always some ups and downs, potholes, sand, different terrain or stuff like that. You cannot have a perfect surface that does not need any suspension. It is basically impossible. It is true that the suspension travel won't be that critical if you ride only on the asphalt, but you will still need traction in every given moment. Also, when you ride on the high speed, the forces that compress or decompress the suspension will be much stronger. So you can easily miss a corner, or you won't be able to stop because the suspension was too weak to provide the necessary traction that was needed in this specific moment. You might try to resist again and have your counter-arguments that the tires are more important than the suspension because they're actually touching the ground. But it is not exactly like that, because have you ever ridden a motorcycle or a car with a broken suspension? Only then you understand what exactly I mean. So, should you upgrade your motorcycle suspension? Well, if you are more than 80 kilograms, your riding gear included, it is a good idea. It is not necessary, you can ride without it, but if you can afford it, go for it, and I don't think that you will regret. Especially if you plan to have many off-road miles on your trip. It will be also very beneficial if you have a passenger and a lot of luggage. It is true that you can preload your spring and forks a little bit to cope with that, but it is not going to be the same, and you will also shorten your suspension travel. If your suspension is weak or the suspension travel is not enough, it is more likely that you will hit the bottom of it. In other words, it will compress too much and it will hit the metal end. If this repeats a number of times, sooner or later it will destroy your suspension. Of course, if this is your case, it is worth to spend some money and upgrade your suspension, maybe for example with the stiffer springs in your forks and your shock absorber. This will be much better, very noticeable, because the springs will be set exactly for your weight. This will help you have a proper suck on your model and will completely change the way it reacts, not only on the bumpy terrain, but also in any other roads that you plan to have in the future. After that, if you still want it and have extra money, you might think about things like valves, cartridges, different shims, and so on and so forth. But keep in mind that once you start going in this direction, it will be very difficult to stop, especially if you have the necessary budget. One thing I can tell you for sure, by changing only the springs inside of your shock absorber and forks will be way more noticeable than to have a new valves, cartridges, shims, or anything that you can find on the market today. Or to say it in different words, you will notice 80–90% change only from the springs compared to the maybe 10–20% from all of the rest, even though they will cost maybe 5 times more. I know this from my personal experience, having ridden many motorcycles with all the options. You don't have to believe me, but before you decided to purchase anything, go and talk with someone who already did it. Sometimes, especially when the price is too high, people expect too much, and all of this leads to some great disappointments. Or they listen to some professional riders, but always keep in mind that these professional riders, this is what they do for living. They know exactly what they have to look for when they ride the motorcycle. For a normal Joe, this is like a rocket science. Recently, a friend of mine decided to upgrade his 10R700 suspension. He already got a stiffer springs, so do I. And he changed now the valves, the shims and sturgeons inside. So it's supposed to be completely different suspension. And it is different suspension, but it is not so easy noticeable. So we spent like 2 hours riding around, trying different terrains, sitting from one bike to another, swapping it. So for example, ride it 10 or 15 minutes and sit on mine, and then get it back on the different terrains, on the bumpy roads, on stuff like that. And it was barely noticeable. On the other hand, when we changed only the springs, it was like this, poof, like a completely new motorcycle. That's why I said, it is definitely worth the change if you have the money, if you can afford it, but it is not that noticeable. So the question is still here. Should you upgrade your motorcycle suspension? Well guys, I already told you twice, but I'm gonna tell you again. If you're more than 80 kilograms and you can afford it, go for it. I don't think that you will ever regret. It is not necessary, you can ride it as it is, but it will definitely help during your trips or your just simple rides. I hope that this video will help you at least one person. Press like or dislike, whatever it deserves. If you subscribe, even better. See you in the next one. Ciao.